Margaret Shun looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and smiled. At 67 years old, she had perfected the art of being invisible. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a faded blue sweater she had bought at a thrift store 3 years ago. Her worn sneakers had seen better days, but they were comfortable for her daily walks around the neighborhood. Nobody would guess that the woman staring back at her was worth $95 million. She walked to her kitchen and poured herself a cup of coffee from the same pot she had used for the past 15 years. The kitchen was clean but ordinary. The appliances were old but worked perfectly fine. The wooden table had scratches and marks from years of use. Everything in her small suburban home told the story of a woman who lived simply and carefully. Watched her spending. Margaret had learned long ago that people treated you differently when they knew you had money. She discovered this the hard way 30 years earlier when she first started making real money from her investments. Back then she had been open about her success. Friends suddenly needed loans. Family members expected expensive gifts. Strangers became incredibly friendly when they learned about her wealth. It had been exhausting and heartbreaking. So Margaret made a choice. She would live like a regular person. She drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic that got great gas mileage. She shopped at the local grocery store and always used coupons. Her neighbors thought she was a retired bookkeeper who lived on a small pension. They had no idea that she owned 3 apartment buildings in the city and had a stock portfolio that most millionaires would envy. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Margaret opened the door to find her son David standing there with a huge smile on his face. At 32, David worked as a teacher at the local high school. He was a good man with a kind heart, just like his father had been before he passed. Away 10 years ago? "Mom, I have incredible news," David said, practically bouncing with excitement. Margaret invited him in and made him sit at the kitchen table. She poured him coffee in his favorite mug, the one with a chip on the handle that she refused to throw away, because David had made it for her in art class when he was 12. "Rebecca said yes," David announced, his face glowing with happiness. "We're getting married." Margaret felt a mix of emotions wash over her. She was happy for her son, but she also felt nervous. She had met Rebecca several times, and something about the young woman made her uncomfortable. Rebecca worked in marketing for a big company downtown. She drove an expensive car and wore designer clothes. She lived in a fancy apartment building. That probably cost more per month than most people made in a year, but David loved her, and that was what mattered. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Margaret said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "Tell me everything." David launched into the story of how he had proposed. He had taken Rebecca to their favorite restaurant, the same place where they had their first date 2 years ago. He had hidden the ring in her dessert, which Margaret thought was sweet but worried about Rebecca's reaction to such a simple proposal. She was so surprised, David continued. "And the ring fit perfectly. I saved up for 8 months to buy it." Margaret knew exactly how much teachers made, and she could guess that David had probably spent close to 2 months' salary on that ring. It made her both proud and sad. Proud because her son was generous and loving. Sad because she could have helped him buy something much nicer without even noticing the expense, but David didn't know about her money. She had kept it secret from him too, wanting him to grow up with good values and a strong work ethic. She had watched too many wealthy families where the children became lazy and entitled because they knew they would inherit everything. "When are you planning to have the wedding?" Margaret asked. "We're thinking next spring," David said. "Rebecca wants something nice but not too expensive. We know we're both just starting out in our careers." Margaret nodded, but she suspected that Rebecca's idea of not too expensive might be very different from David's. She had noticed that Rebecca seemed to like expensive things, and she wondered how the young woman would react when she learned about the financial reality of marrying a high school teacher. "Have you met her parents yet?" Margaret asked. David's face changed slightly. "Just once, briefly. They seem nice. Her father is a lawyer, and her mother doesn't work. They live in one of those big houses on Elm Street." Margaret knew Elm Street. Well, those houses started at $1 million and went up from there. She felt a knot forming in her stomach. They want to have an engagement dinner next week, David continued. At their country club. They want to meet you properly and start planning the wedding. The knot in Margaret's stomach tightened. She had never been to a country club, but she could imagine what it would be like. Expensive food, fancy decorations, and people who judged others based on their clothes and cars. That sounds lovely, she said, forcing a smile. After David left, Margaret sat alone in her kitchen thinking. She had a decision to make. She could reveal her wealth and make things easier for everyone. David could have the wedding of his dreams. Rebecca's family would probably welcome her with open arms once they knew she could contribute significantly to the wedding expenses, but something stopped her. Margaret had learned over the years that money changed everything. It changed how people talked to you, how they treated you, and what they expected from you. She wanted to know who these people really were before they found out about her financial situation. She walked to her bedroom and opened the closet. In the back behind her everyday clothes hung 3 expensive dresses she had bought years ago but never worn. She also had jewelry in a safety deposit box at the bank, pieces that her late husband had given her and investments she had made in precious gems, but she wasn't ready to show that side of herself yet. Margaret made her decision. She would keep her secret, at least for now. She would go to the engagement dinner dressed like the simple retired woman everyone thought she was. She would smile politely and let Rebecca's family judge her based on appearances. It would be an interesting experiment. She would learn who these people really were and how they treated someone they thought had no money or social status. She would see if they welcomed her son's mother with kindness and respect, or if they looked down on her for being ordinary. Margaret had a feeling she already knew which way it would go, but she hoped she would be wrong. For David's sake, she really hoped she would be wrong. She finished her coffee and started planning what she would wear to meet her future in-laws. It would be the performance of a lifetime, and she was determined to play her role perfectly. The real question was whether anyone else would pass the test. Margaret stood in front of her closet for 20 minutes, carefully choosing her outfit for the engagement dinner. She picked a simple navy blue dress that she had worn to church for the past 5 years. It was clean and presentable, but definitely not expensive. She added her late husband's small pearl earrings and a watch she had bought at a department store sale. Looking in the mirror, she saw exactly what she intended. A woman who looked like she shopped carefully and lived on a budget. Someone who probably clipped coupons and waited for sales before buying anything. It was perfect for tonight's test. The Riverside Country Club sat on a hill overlooking the city. Margaret had driven past it many times but never imagined she would be walking through its front doors. The building was impressive, with tall white columns and perfectly manicured gardens. Expensive cars filled the parking lot. Mercedes, BMWs, and luxury SUVs that cost more than most people's houses. Margaret parked her Honda Civic between a shiny Lexus and a Tesla. The contrast was almost funny. She checked her appearance one more time in the rearview mirror and took a deep breath. The performance was about to begin. Inside, the club was even more impressive. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings. Original paintings decorated the walls. Everything screamed money and status. Margaret felt like she had stepped into a different world, which in many ways she had. David was waiting for her in the lobby, looking nervous in his best suit. The same suit he wore to parent-teacher conferences and school board meetings. Rebecca stood beside him in a dress that probably cost more than David made in a week. Her jewelry sparkled under the fancy lights. "Mom, you look nice," David said, giving her a hug. "Thank you, sweetheart," Margaret replied, noticing how Rebecca's eyes traveled up and down her outfit with barely hidden disappointment. "My parents are waiting in the private dining room," Rebecca said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "They're excited to meet you properly." They walked through the main dining room, past tables full of well-dressed people eating expensive food and drinking wine that probably cost more per bottle than Margaret supposedly spent on groceries in a month. She noticed how some people glanced at her simple outfit with curiosity. clearly wondering how she had gained access to their exclusive world. The private dining room was smaller, but just as elegant. A man in an expensive suit stood when they entered. He was tall and confident, with silver hair and the kind of smile that politicians used when they wanted something. This had to be Rebecca's father. "You must be Margaret," he said, extending his hand. "I'm William, Rebecca's father. Welcome to our club." His handshake was firm but brief, like he was checking off a box on a to-do list. Margaret noticed how his eyes quickly took in her simple dress and practical shoes. Before looking away with polite disinterest, Rebecca's mother was a different story entirely. She was perfectly put together from head to toe. Her blonde hair was styled in an expensive salon cut. Her makeup was flawless. Her dress looked like it belonged on a fashion magazine cover. Even her fingernails were perfectly manicured with what looked like real diamonds embedded in the polish. "I'm Patricia," she said, offering a hand that felt like it had never done a day of manual labor. "Please, sit down. We've ordered some appetizers." Margaret sat in the chair David pulled out for her, directly across from Patricia. She could feel the woman studying her like a scientist, examining an interesting but disappointing specimen. "David tells us you're retired," William said as the waiter poured wine into crystal glasses. "What did you do before retirement?" "I was a bookkeeper," Margaret replied, which was technically true. She had kept her own books for decades, tracking every investment and expense. "Oh, how practical," Patricia said with a tone that made it clear she didn't think being practical was particularly admirable. "I suppose someone has to do those jobs?" Margaret felt the first sting of condescension but kept her expression neutral. "I enjoyed it. Numbers have always made sense to me." "That's wonderful," Patricia continued. "I'm sure it was steady work." "Not exciting, but steady." "Security is so important when you don't have many options." David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Rebecca focused intently on her salad. William checked his expensive watch as if he had somewhere more important to be. The conversation continued in the same pattern throughout the evening. Patricia would ask questions that seemed polite on the surface, but carried hidden insults underneath. She asked about Margaret's neighborhood, describing it as quaint and affordable. She inquired about Margaret's car, mentioning how practical it must be to have something so economical. When the main course arrived, Patricia launched into stories about their recent vacation to Europe. She described expensive hotels, private tours, and shopping trips that cost more than most people's annual salaries. She talked about their summer house in the mountains and their winter condo in Florida. "We're so blessed to be able to enjoy these experiences," Patricia said, looking directly at Margaret. "Of course, not everyone is fortunate enough to have these opportunities. I imagine you spend your time closer to home." "I do enjoy simple pleasures," Margaret replied calmly. "A good book, walks in the park, time with family." "How sweet," Patricia said in a voice usually reserved for children and pets. "Sometimes the simple life is all we can manage." William jumped into the conversation when they started discussing the wedding. "We're thinking of having it at the Grand Ballroom downtown," he announced. "It's where all the best families hold their important events." Margaret knew the Grand Ballroom. She had attended charity events there before she decided to live simply. It was beautiful but extremely expensive. "That sounds lovely," David said, though Margaret could see worry creeping into his eyes. "Of course, it's quite an investment," William continued. "But Rebecca is our only daughter, and we want her to have the best. We're prepared to cover most of the expenses, naturally." Patricia leaned forward with what she probably thought was a kind expression. "We know that teachers' salaries don't allow for much extravagance. And of course, Margaret, we understand that retirement incomes can be quite limited. We don't expect you to contribute beyond your means." Margaret felt her jaw tighten but kept her voice steady. "That's very thoughtful of you." "We just want everyone to be comfortable," Patricia added. "Perhaps you could handle something smaller, like flowers for the rehearsal dinner. Nothing too elaborate, of course. Something within your budget range." David finally spoke up, his voice tight with embarrassment. "We haven't really discussed the details yet." Oh, but we must plan ahead, William said. These things take time to organize properly. We want to make sure everyone knows their role and what they can realistically contribute. As the evening continued, Margaret realized she was witnessing something she had suspected but hoped wasn't true. These people had already decided she was beneath them. In their minds, she was a charity case to be managed and pitied, someone who needed to be handled carefully and kept in her place. The final insult came as they were leaving. Patricia pulled David aside while Margaret gathered her purse. "Your mother seems sweet," Patricia said in a voice just loud enough for Margaret to hear. "I'm sure she's done her best raising you on her own. It must have been difficult without much financial support." Margaret walked to her car feeling a mix of anger and sadness. Not for herself, but for David. Her son was marrying into a family that looked down on the woman who had raised him. They saw her as an embarrassment to be tolerated rather than a person to be respected. As she drove home, Margaret made a decision. The test would continue. She would see just how far these people would go in their treatment of someone they considered inferior. And more importantly, she would see how long David would allow it to happen. The real experiment was just beginning. The wedding planning began the very next week, and Margaret quickly realized that the engagement dinner had been just a preview of what was coming. Patricia had appointed herself as the wedding coordinator, and she made it clear that Margaret's role would be minimal. The first meeting took place at Patricia's house, a massive stone mansion that looked like something from a magazine. Margaret drove up the circular driveway in her Honda Civic, parking behind Rebecca's BMW and Patricia's Mercedes. She felt like she was delivering groceries to the back door. Patricia greeted her at the front entrance wearing a silk blouse that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly pretend grocery budget. The house was even more impressive inside than outside. Marble floors, oil paintings, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. Come in," Patricia said with fake enthusiasm. "I've set up everything in the sunroom. We have so much to discuss." The sunroom was bright and airy, with windows overlooking a perfectly landscaped garden. Rebecca was already there, surrounded by wedding magazines, fabric samples, and what looked like enough paperwork to plan a small war. "Margaret, how wonderful that you could make it," Rebecca said without looking up from a flower catalog. "We've already started making some preliminary decisions." Margaret sat down in the chair that was obviously meant for her. It was positioned slightly away from the main table, like a child's seat at a grown-up dinner party. Patricia and Rebecca had claimed the spots with all the planning materials spread out in front of them. "Now then," Patricia began, pulling out a thick folder. "I've been planning weddings for my friends' daughters for years, so I know exactly how these things should be done. The key is to establish a budget and stick to it." She opened the folder and pulled out several sheets of paper covered with numbers. "I've broken down all the major expenses. The venue, catering, flowers, music, photography, and so on. William and I are prepared to handle the significant costs, of course." Margaret glanced at the numbers and almost choked. The total budget was over $80,000 for one day. She had seen people buy houses for less money. "That seems quite expensive," Margaret said carefully. Patricia waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, this is actually quite reasonable for a wedding of this caliber. Rebecca deserves the best, and we want David to see how a proper family celebrates important milestones." The comment stung. Margaret understood the hidden message. This was how wealthy, important families did things. Unlike David's family, which presumably didn't know any better. "Now, Margaret," Patricia continued, "we need to discuss your contribution. I know that fixed incomes can be challenging, so we've tried to find something appropriate for your situation." She slid a piece of paper across the table. Margaret looked down to see a list of what were clearly the least expensive and least important items: napkins, guestbook, transportation for the elderly relatives, wedding favors. "We thought you might like to handle the rehearsal dinner," Patricia said with the kind of smile people used when they were doing someone a big favor. "Nothing too elaborate, of course. Maybe a nice family restaurant, somewhere comfortable and affordable." Margaret felt her temper rising but kept her voice calm. What did you have in mind? Well, Patricia said, exchanging a look with Rebecca, there's a lovely Italian place downtown. Very casual, very reasonably priced. The kind of place where everyone can feel comfortable, regardless of their background. Rebecca nodded enthusiastically. It's perfect for that kind of informal gathering, nothing too fancy or intimidating. Margaret realized they were basically suggesting she host the rehearsal dinner at a chain restaurant. The kind of place where families with screaming children went for cheap pasta and unlimited breadsticks. I'll look into it, Margaret said through gritted teeth. The meeting continued for 2 hours, with Patricia making decisions and Rebecca agreeing to everything. Margaret was consulted on exactly nothing. When they discussed flowers, Patricia explained that she had already spoken to the florist at the country club. When they talked about music, she had a friend who provided entertainment for all the best events. The photographer is someone we've used before, Patricia announced. He's quite expensive, but his work is exceptional. He knows how to capture the elegance of these occasions. What about the dress shopping? Margaret asked, thinking this might be something she could share with her future daughter-in-law. Patricia and Rebecca exchanged another look. Oh, we've already made an appointment at the boutique downtown, Rebecca said. My mother and I have been planning this shopping trip for weeks. I'd love to come along, Margaret offered. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Patricia cleared her throat. Well, it's quite an exclusive place. Very expensive. I'm not sure you'd be comfortable there. The dresses start at several $1,000s. I see, Margaret said quietly. But don't worry, Patricia added quickly. We'll take lots of pictures. And I'm sure we can find you something lovely for the mother dash of dash groom dress, somewhere more in your price range. Margaret realized she was being systematically excluded from every important aspect of her son's wedding. These women had decided she was too poor, too unsophisticated, and too embarrassing to be included in the real planning. The final blow came when they started discussing the guest list. Patricia pulled out another folder, this one even thicker than the first. We have about 200 people on our side, she announced proudly. Family, friends, business associates, people from the club. All the important families in the city will be represented. She looked expectantly at Margaret. How many will you be inviting? Margaret thought about her small circle of friends. Her neighbors, a few people from the library where she volunteered, some former colleagues from her supposed bookkeeping days. Maybe 30 people, she said. Patricia's eyebrows shot up. 30? Oh my. Well, I suppose that's what happens when you live a quieter life. Not everyone has extensive social connections. Rebecca leaned forward with what she probably thought was a helpful expression. Maybe we should think about this carefully. We want all our guests to feel comfortable with each other. Sometimes it's better when people stick with their own social groups. Margaret stared at her future daughter-in-law. What exactly are you suggesting? Well, Rebecca said, looking to her mother for support, your guests might feel out of place at such a formal event. Country club weddings can be intimidating for people who aren't used to that environment. Patricia nodded vigorously. Rebecca makes an excellent point. We want everyone to enjoy themselves. Perhaps your guests would prefer a separate, more casual celebration, something more suited to their comfort level. Margaret felt like she had been slapped. These women were suggesting that her friends and family weren't good enough to attend the same wedding as their wealthy friends. That somehow, people who worked regular jobs and lived in normal houses wouldn't be able to handle eating dinner in the same room as lawyers and doctors. I think my guests can handle fancy napkins and silverware, Margaret said, her voice dangerously quiet. Oh, of course they can, Patricia said quickly. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. It's just that some people feel more comfortable in familiar surroundings. The meeting ended with Margaret feeling like she had been put in her place. She was expected to pay for the cheap parts of the wedding, stay out of the important planning, and invite as few people as possible to avoid embarrassing the bride's family. Driving home, Margaret thought about her late husband. He would have been furious at how these people were treating her. He had always said that respect wasn't about money or social status. It was about treating people with basic human dignity. That evening, David called to ask how the planning meeting had gone. It was fine, Margaret said, not wanting to burden him with the truth. Rebecca's mom seems to have everything under control, David said. I'm grateful that you don't have to worry about all the details, Margaret almost laughed. She wasn't worried about the details because she wasn't being allowed to participate in any of them, but she didn't say that. Instead, she asked how he was feeling about everything. Honestly, Mom, it's a bit overwhelming. The whole thing seems so much more complicated and expensive than I expected. But Rebecca says this is how weddings are supposed to be. Margaret heard the uncertainty in her son's voice and felt a pang of sadness. David was starting to realize that he was marrying into a world where he might always feel like an outsider. Just remember, Margaret said gently, the wedding is one day. The marriage is what really matters. After hanging up, Margaret sat in her simple kitchen and made a decision. She would continue to play her role as the poor, unsophisticated mother-in-law. But she would also start keeping a detailed record of every slight, every insult, and every moment of disrespect. These people thought they could treat her badly because she had no power to fight back. They were about to learn how wrong they were. 3 months before the wedding, Margaret thought things couldn't get any worse. She was wrong. The latest humiliation came during what Patricia called a family dinner at her house. Margaret had been invited, though she suspected it was only because Rebecca felt obligated to include her. The evening was supposed to be about finalizing the wedding details and celebrating the upcoming union. Margaret arrived at the mansion wearing her best dress, the same navy blue one from the engagement dinner. She had pressed it carefully and even bought new shoes for the occasion. They were simple black flats from a discount store, but they were new and clean. William answered the door this time, wearing a casual sweater that probably cost more than Margaret's entire outfit. "Margaret, good to see you," he said with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Everyone's in the dining room." The dining room was set with china that looked like it belonged in a museum. Crystal glasses caught the light from an enormous chandelier. Fresh flowers in an expensive vase sat in the center of a table that could easily seat 12 people. Patricia was already seated at the head of the table, looking like a queen holding court. Rebecca sat to her right, beautiful as always in a designer dress. David was across from Rebecca, looking uncomfortable in his best shirt and tie. "Margaret, dear, please sit here," Patricia said, pointing to a chair at the far end of the table. It was technically a seat at the table, but it might as well have been in another room. Margaret would be too far away to participate in most conversations. Dinner was served by a woman Patricia introduced as our housekeeper. Margaret felt sorry for the older woman who quietly brought course after course of expensive food. The meal was delicious, but Margaret barely tasted it. She was too focused on the conversation happening at the other end of the table. Patricia dominated the discussion, talking about final preparations for the wedding. She mentioned the flowers, which would cost more than most people's cars. She discussed the menu, which included items Margaret had never heard of. She talked about the guest list, which seemed to include half the city's wealthy elite. "Now, David," Patricia said during the main course, "I wanted to discuss the ceremony seating arrangements with you." David looked up from his plate. "What? About them?" "Well, we need to think carefully about where everyone sits. The front rows are traditionally reserved for immediate family and the most important guests." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "Of course, your mother will be seated appropriately," Patricia continued, "but we need to consider the optics of the situation." "Optics?" David asked, his voice getting tight. Rebecca jumped in to help her mother. "What Mom means is that we want to make sure everyone feels comfortable. Some of your family might be more at ease sitting together rather than being scattered throughout the important sections." Margaret gripped her fork harder. She knew exactly what they were suggesting. "We've arranged for your mother and her guests to have lovely seats," Patricia said with that fake bright tone she always used when delivering bad news. "They'll be in a wonderful section toward the back. where they can enjoy the ceremony without feeling pressured to interact with people they might not have much in common with. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. They were literally putting her in the back of the room for her own son's wedding. Not because there wasn't enough space, not because of any practical reason, but because they were embarrassed by her and her friends. David's face turned red. "You want to put my mother in the back?" "Now, don't get upset," William said, speaking for the first time during dinner. "This is actually quite common. Different social groups often prefer to sit together. Your mother's friends will be much more comfortable with people from similar backgrounds." "Similar backgrounds?" Margaret finally spoke, her voice dangerously quiet. Patricia shifted uncomfortably. "What William means is that sometimes people feel out of place when they're surrounded by unfamiliar social situations. We just want everyone to enjoy themselves." Rebecca nodded enthusiastically. "It's really for the best. Your mom won't have to worry about making conversation with people she doesn't know. She can relax and enjoy the ceremony with her own friends." Margaret stared at her future daughter-in-law. "You think I'm not capable of having a conversation with your friends?" "Oh, that's not what I meant at all," Rebecca said quickly. "It's just that you have such different interests and experiences. My mother's friends mostly talk about travel and charity work and business. You might find it boring." The insult was so casual, so thoughtless, that it took Margaret's breath away. These people genuinely believed she was too stupid or too unsophisticated to hold a conversation with educated adults. "And there's another matter we need to discuss," Patricia continued, apparently unaware of the bomb she had just dropped. "The reception seating chart." She pulled out yet another folder filled with diagrams and lists. "We've arranged the tables very carefully to ensure good conversation flow. The head table will be for the wedding party and immediate family of course." Margaret waited for her to continue. "We thought you might be more comfortable at one of the family tables toward the back, with your sister and her husband and perhaps some of David's teacher friends. People you already know and feel comfortable with." David finally exploded. "Are you seriously trying to hide my mother at her own son's wedding?" "David, please don't raise your voice," Rebecca said sharply. "We're trying to be considerate of everyone's feelings." "Considerate?" David's voice was getting louder. "You're treating my mother like she's some kind of embarrassment." William stepped in with his louder voice. "Son, I think you're overreacting. This is simply a matter of social dynamics. People are more comfortable with their peers." "My mother raised me by herself after my father died," David said, his hands shaking with anger. "She worked 2 jobs to put food on the table and clothes on my back. She sacrificed everything so I could go to college and become a teacher. And you want to stick her in the corner like she's not good enough to sit with your fancy friends?" Patricia looked genuinely confused by David's emotional response. "We're not saying she's not good enough. We're saying she might be more comfortable with people from her own social circle." "What exactly do you think my social circle is?" Margaret asked quietly. The table fell silent. Patricia looked like she had been asked to explain quantum physics. "Well," she finally said, "you know, people who work regular jobs. People who live simply. People who don't have much experience with formal social events." Margaret stood up slowly. Every eye at the table was on her. "Thank you for dinner," she said calmly. "It was very educational." She walked toward the door, her back straight and her head high. Behind her, she could hear David arguing with Rebecca and her parents. Their voices were getting louder and more heated. Margaret didn't wait to hear how the argument ended. She got in her Honda Civic and drove home, her hands shaking with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. That night she sat in her kitchen and cried for the first time since her husband's funeral. Not because of the insults to her. She had dealt with worse things in her life. She cried because of what this was doing to David. Her son was caught between the woman he loved and the mother who had raised him. He was being forced to choose between his future and his past. And no matter what he chose, someone would be hurt. 11 o'clock, her phone rang. It was her sister, calling from across the country for their weekly check-in. "How are you doing, sweetie?" her sister asked. Margaret broke down and told her everything. The condescending comments, the exclusion from wedding planning, the seating arrangements, all of it. Her sister listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, there was a long silence. How long are you going to let this continue? Her sister finally asked. What do you mean? You have $95 million sitting in the bank and you're letting these people treat you like garbage. Why? Margaret wiped her eyes. Because I wanted to know who they really are. Well, now you know. The question is, what are you going to do about it? After hanging up, Margaret sat in the dark and thought about her sister's words. She did know who these people were now. They were cruel, shallow, and prejudiced. They judged people based on money and social status rather than character and kindness, but the real test wasn't whether they would fail. She had known they would from the beginning. The real test was whether David would finally stand up to them, whether he would protect the woman who had given him everything, even if it meant confronting the woman he wanted to marry. Tomorrow, Margaret decided she would find out exactly where her son's loyalties lay. Margaret thought she was alone in her battle against Rebecca's family, but she was wrong. Help came from the most unexpected source. 2 weeks after the disastrous family dinner, Patricia invited everyone to a backyard barbecue at her house. Margaret almost didn't go, but David begged her to come. He was still trying to fix things between his mother and his future in-laws, though Margaret could see the stress was wearing on him. The barbecue was typical Patricia, what she called a casual backyard gathering. Looked like something from a magazine. Professional catering, perfectly arranged outdoor furniture, and decorations that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Margaret arrived wearing a simple sundress and sandals. She had stopped trying to impress these people weeks ago. Now she just wanted to get through family events without losing her temper. The usual crowd was there. William was manning an expensive grill while talking business with other wealthy men. Patricia was holding court with her friends, all of them dressed like they were attending a garden party at the White House. Rebecca was showing off her engagement ring to anyone who would look. Margaret found a quiet corner and tried to stay invisible. She had learned that the less attention she drew to herself, the fewer opportunities these people had to insult her. That's when she noticed him. Rebecca had a younger brother that Margaret had only met briefly at the engagement dinner. He was in his late 20s with dark hair and kind eyes that reminded her of David when he was younger. While everyone else was networking and showing off, he was sitting alone at a table near the back of the yard, sketching in a notebook. Margaret had always been drawn to quiet people. They were usually the most interesting ones in any crowd. She walked over and sat down across from him. Mind if I join you? She asked. He looked up, surprised. Of course not. I'm Jake, Rebecca's brother. We met briefly at the engagement dinner. Remember, I'm Margaret. Jake closed his notebook quickly, but not before Margaret caught a glimpse of his work. Even from that brief look, she could tell he was talented. The sketches were detailed and full of life. You're an artist, she said. Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's what I tell myself. My family prefers to call it my hobby phase. Margaret understood immediately. Jake was the black sheep of his perfect family, just like she was becoming the embarrassing relative that everyone tolerated. How long have you been drawing? She asked. Since I was a kid. I went to art school, got my degree, and tried to make it work. But according to my parents, art isn't a real career. They keep waiting for me to grow up and get a proper job. Margaret looked around the yard at all the wealthy, successful people. What do they consider a proper job? Law, like my father. Business, like my uncle. Medicine, like my cousin. Something that makes money and impresses their friends at the country club. Jake's voice was bitter, and Margaret could hear years of disappointment and criticism in his tone. What kind of art do you do? She asked. Jake hesitated, then opened his notebook again. The pages were filled with incredible drawings. Portraits of people that captured not just their appearance but their emotions, landscapes that seemed to move with life, abstract pieces that spoke to something deep in Margaret's soul. These are beautiful, Margaret said, and she meant it. Thank you. But beautiful doesn't pay the bills, according to my family. Margaret spent the next hour looking through Jake's artwork and listening to his stories. He told her about art school, about the gallery where he had shown his work, about the dreams he was slowly giving up because he couldn't afford to chase them anymore. "I work at a coffee shop downtown to pay rent," Jake said. "My parents are mortified. They tell their friends I'm finding myself because they're too embarrassed to admit their son serves lattes for a living." Margaret felt a familiar anger rising in her chest. It was the same anger she felt when people dismissed David's teaching career as not ambitious enough, or when they treated her like she was stupid because she didn't have an expensive education. "There's nothing wrong with honest work," Margaret said firmly. Jake smiled for the first time that afternoon. "You're the first person in my family to say that." They were interrupted by Patricia's voice calling across the yard. "Jake, dear, could you help bring out more chairs from the garage? We have guests who need somewhere to sit." Jake closed his notebook with a sigh. "Duty calls. Can't have the family embarrassment just sitting around talking to people." As Jake walked away, Margaret watched Patricia whisper something to one of her friends while pointing in their direction. Both women laughed in a way that made Margaret's skin crawl. Later in the afternoon, Margaret overheard a conversation that made her blood boil. She was getting a drink from the kitchen when she heard Patricia talking to William in the next room. "I don't know what to do about Jake," Patricia was saying. "He's 28 years old and still playing with crayons like a child. It's embarrassing." "He'll grow out of it," William replied. "We just need to stop enabling him. Maybe if we cut off his allowance, he'll finally get serious about his life. The problem is, he's influencing Rebecca's future mother-in-law. I saw them talking for an hour today. We can't have our family failures bonding with their family problems." Margaret gripped her glass so hard she thought it might break. These people didn't just look down on her. They looked down on their own son because he didn't fit their narrow definition of success. When she returned to the backyard, Jake was back at his table, but he looked dejected. Margaret sat down next to him. "Rough afternoon?" she asked. "My dad cornered me by the garage. Asked when I was going to stop playing around and get a real job. Then my mother suggested I might want to consider going back to school for business or law." Margaret studied Jake's face. She saw the same hurt and frustration that she had seen in David's eyes for weeks. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said. "Sure." "If money wasn't an issue, what would you do with your art?" Jake's eyes lit up for a moment, then dimmed again. "There's this artist residency program in Colorado. It's 6 months of just creating with studio space and mentorship from established artists. It could change everything for me professionally. But it costs $25,000 and I'd have to quit my job." "Have you applied?" "What's the point? I could never afford it. And even if I could, my family would never support me taking 6 months off to play with art, as my father puts it." Margaret made a decision in that moment. Jake was a good person with real talent, trapped in a family that didn't value him. Just like she was trapped in a situation where people judged her based on their assumptions about her bank account. "What? If I told you that sometimes help comes from unexpected places?" Margaret asked. Jake looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean that there are people in this world who believe in supporting dreams even when families don't." Before Jake could ask what she meant, Rebecca appeared at their table. "Jake, Mom wants you to help move the patio furniture back into storage," Rebecca said. Then she looked at Margaret with barely concealed annoyance. "I hope you're not filling his head with more unrealistic ideas about his art career." Margaret stood up slowly. "I was just telling Jake that talented people deserve support and encouragement." Rebecca laughed. "Support doesn't pay bills. Jake needs to learn that dreams are nice, but reality is what matters." After Rebecca walked away, Jake shook his head sadly. "She's right, you know. Dreams don't pay bills." "Maybe not," Margaret said. "But they're what make life worth living." That night, Margaret went home and made some phone calls. She had connections in the art world that she had made during her secret wealthy years. By the end of the week, she had anonymously funded a new scholarship program at the Colorado Artist Residency. The scholarship was specifically designed for talented artists from conservative families who needed financial support to pursue their dreams. Jake received the letter 2 weeks later. He had been selected for a full scholarship to the program, covering all expenses plus a small living allowance. When he called to tell Margaret the news, she could hear the joy and disbelief in his voice. "I can't believe it," he said. "They said my portfolio showed exceptional promise and that the scholarship was funded by an anonymous donor who believed in supporting undervalued artistic talent." Margaret smiled as she listened to his excitement. Sometimes the best way to fight back against cruel people was to quietly help the people they had hurt. Jake became her ally in the family, though he never knew about her secret. He started defending her at family gatherings, pointing out the hypocrisy of people who claimed to value character while treating others badly. His support meant more to Margaret than Jake could ever know. In a family where she felt completely alone, she had found one person who understood what it was like to be judged unfairly. The wedding was still 2 months away, and Margaret was starting to form a plan. 2 weeks before the wedding, Margaret thought she had experienced every possible humiliation these people could dish out. She was about to learn that Patricia's creativity for cruelty had no limits. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while Margaret was having her coffee and reading the newspaper. She had been enjoying a rare, peaceful moment when the phone rang. "Margaret, dear, it's Patricia," came the overly sweet voice through the receiver. "I hope I'm not calling too early." Margaret glanced at the clock. It was 9:30 in the morning. "Not at all. What can I do for you?" "Well, I have some wonderful news about the wedding arrangements. We've been working so hard to make everything perfect for Rebecca and David." Margaret waited, knowing from experience that Patricia's wonderful news usually meant something awful for everyone else. "We've had to make a few last-minute adjustments to accommodate all our guests," Patricia continued. "You know how these things can be? So many important people want to celebrate with us." "What kind of adjustments?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Well, it turns out we've had more RSVPs than expected. The governor's wife decided she can attend after all, and the mayor's family will be there, plus several other prominent families. It's really quite an honor for Rebecca to have such distinguished guests." Margaret felt her stomach start to knot. "I see. The thing is, dear, we need to restructure the seating to accommodate everyone properly. You understand how important it is to seat people according to their position in the community." Here it comes, Margaret thought. "So we've decided to create a lovely, separate area for the older relatives and family friends. Think of it as a more intimate setting, away from all the formal protocol and business networking. Much more comfortable for people who prefer a quieter atmosphere." Margaret gripped the phone tighter. "Are you moving me away from the family tables?" "Oh, it's not moving you away, dear. It's giving you a better experience. You'll be seated with David's great-aunt Helen and her husband, plus some other lovely older relatives. And your sister and her husband, of course. People more in your age group and social circle." The insult was so massive that Margaret actually laughed out loud. "My social circle?" Patricia seemed to take the laugh as agreement. "Exactly. People you'll have more in common with. You won't have to worry about making conversation with business executives and politicians. You can just relax and enjoy the celebration." Margaret was quiet for so long that Patricia felt the need to fill the silence. "The tables are still in the same room, of course, just positioned where you'll be more comfortable. Near the back, away from all the speeches and formal presentations." "Near the back," Margaret repeated slowly. "Yes, with a lovely view of everything. You'll be able to see the whole celebration without being right in the middle of all the chaos." Margaret realized she was being relegated to what was essentially the children's table, except it was the poor relatives and elderly people table instead. "And there's one more tiny little thing," Patricia continued, her voice getting even more artificially sweet, "about your speech." Margaret had been planning to give a short speech as the mother of the groom. She had been working on it for weeks, crafting words that would honor her son and welcome Rebecca into their family, despite everything these people had put her through. "We've been looking at the timeline for the reception, and it's gotten quite packed with all the important toasts and presentations. The mayor wants to say a few words, and William's business partner is giving a speech about David and Rebecca's future. Margaret waited for the axe to fall. So we've decided to streamline the family speeches. Keep them short and sweet so we don't lose people's attention. Your speech was lovely, dear, but perhaps a bit too detailed for this crowd. We think it would be better if you just kept it to a simple thank you. Maybe 2 or 3 sentences at most. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. You want me to cut my speech to 3 sentences? Just the highlights, you know. Thank everyone for coming, say how happy you are for the couple, that sort of thing. Nothing too personal or lengthy. We want to keep the energy up for the dancing. I see. I knew you'd understand. You're always so practical about these things. But Patricia wasn't done. The final blow was still coming. Oh, and one last thing. The timing of the reception has been adjusted slightly. We're starting the formal program a bit earlier than planned, and it might run quite late. Sometimes these events with prominent guests can go past midnight. Margaret had a terrible feeling about where this was going. We were thinking that you might want to consider leaving after the dinner service, before things get too late and, well, too loud. The dancing and after-party portion can get quite energetic, and we know that people your age often prefer to retire early. Margaret stared at the wall in shock. You want me to leave my son's wedding reception early? Not leave early, dear. Leave at an appropriate time. After you've seen the important parts, the ceremony, the dinner, the main speeches. You wouldn't really be missing anything after that, except dancing and socializing. Socializing at my son's wedding. Well, yes, but it will mostly be younger people and business networking. Not really your crowd, if you know what I mean. Margaret knew exactly what she meant. Patricia was telling her that she wasn't welcome at her own son's wedding celebration, that she should eat her dinner quietly in the back corner and then disappear, before the real party started. I'll think about it, Margaret managed to say. Wonderful. I knew you'd be reasonable about this. We just want everyone to be comfortable and have a good time. After Patricia hung up, Margaret sat in her kitchen, in stunned silence. In the span of one phone call, she had been moved to the worst seats in the house, had her speech cut to nothing, and been told she should leave early. She had been systematically erased from her own son's wedding. Margaret walked to her bedroom and sat on the edge of her bed. She felt exhausted and defeated. For months, she had endured insult after insult, telling herself it was all part of the test, that she was learning important things about these people's character, but this felt different. This wasn't just cruel or thoughtless. This was calculated humiliation designed to make her so uncomfortable that she would stay away entirely. Patricia wanted her gone. Not just quiet or hidden, but actually absent from the most important day of her son's life. The phone rang again. This time it was David. Mom, Rebecca just told me about the seating changes. I had no idea they were planning this. Margaret could hear the distress in his voice. It's fine, sweetheart. No, it's not fine. This is crazy. You're my mother. You should be sitting at the head table with us. David, I don't want to cause problems between you and Rebecca. You're not causing problems. Her family is causing problems. David's voice was getting louder. I can't believe they want you to sit in the back like some distant relative. Margaret felt a spark of hope. Finally, David was seeing what was really happening and asking you to leave early. That's insane, Mom. It's my wedding. I want you there for the whole thing. What are you going to do? Margaret asked quietly. There was a long pause. I don't know. Rebecca says her parents are just trying to manage a difficult situation. That having so many important guests makes everything complicated. Margaret's heart sank. Even now, David was looking for ways to excuse their behavior. Maybe I could talk to them, David continued. Try to work out a compromise. A compromise? Margaret almost laughed. What kind of compromise was there between being treated like family and being treated like an unwanted burden? That night, Margaret walked to her safe and pulled out her financial documents. She spread them across her kitchen table and stared At the numbers, $95 million. Enough money to buy Patricia's country club. Enough money to make every person at that wedding treat her with respect and admiration. All she had to do was reveal the truth. But as Margaret looked at those numbers, she realized something important. If she revealed her wealth now, she would never know if David truly stood up for her or if he only did it because he learned she was rich. She put the documents back in the safe and made her decision. She would attend the wedding, exactly as Patricia had planned. She would sit in the back, give her 3-sentence speech, and leave early if that's what they wanted, but she would also make sure that everyone at that wedding learned exactly who they were dealing with. The final test was about to begin. The morning of the wedding, Margaret woke up with a strange sense of calm. Today was the day everything would change. She had spent the previous evening making phone calls to people she hadn't spoken to in years. Financial advisors, charity coordinators, and a few very surprised event planners. By the time she went to bed, several interesting arrangements had been put in place. Margaret stood in front of her closet, looking at the simple navy dress she had worn to every family event for the past 6 months. Today, she put it back on the hanger and reached for something else entirely. Hidden in the back of her closet, still in its protective garment bag, was a dress she had bought 2 years ago but never worn. It was elegant black silk with subtle beading that caught the light. It had cost more than Patricia probably thought Margaret spent on clothes in an entire year. Margaret put on the dress and looked at herself in the mirror. The transformation was remarkable. She looked sophisticated, confident, and expensive. This was who she really was when she wasn't playing the role of the poor mother in law. Next came her jewelry. Margaret drove to the bank and retrieved several pieces from her safety deposit box. Diamond earrings that had been her grandmother's. A pearl necklace that was worth more than most people's cars. A watch that she had bought herself to celebrate her first $1 million investment return. When she was finished getting ready, Margaret barely recognized herself. Gone was the humble, simple woman everyone expected to see. In her place stood someone who clearly belonged in the same social circles as Patricia's wealthy friends, Margaret. Arrived at the country club and immediately noticed the difference in how people treated her. The valet who took her car keys looked surprised by her appearance. The hostess at the door spoke to her with genuine respect instead of the polite tolerance she usually received. She found David in the groom's preparation room, adjusting his tie with nervous fingers. When he saw her, his mouth fell open. "Mom, you look incredible." "Thank you, sweetheart. You look very handsome." David studied her face. "Are you okay? You seem different today." Margaret smiled and kissed his cheek. "I'm perfect. Today is your wedding day, and I couldn't be happier." It wasn't exactly true, but it wasn't exactly false either. Margaret was happy for David. Even if she had serious concerns about the family he was marrying into, the ceremony went smoothly. Margaret sat in her assigned seat in the back, watching her son marry the woman he loved. Despite everything that had happened, seeing David's joy made her heart full. Whatever else happened today, her son was happy. During the cocktail hour before the reception, Margaret noticed something interesting happening. People kept approaching her, clearly curious about who she was. Her elegant appearance had transformed her from an invisible older woman into someone worth knowing. A woman in an expensive suit walked up to her. "I don't think we've met." "I'm Jennifer. I work with William at the law firm." "I'm Margaret, David's mother." Jennifer's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, I had heard." "Well, I'm delighted to meet you. You look absolutely stunning." Margaret could practically see the woman recalculating her assumptions. This was not the poor, simple woman she had expected to meet. Similar interactions happened throughout the cocktail hour. Business associates of William's, friends of Patricia's, and prominent community members all seemed surprised by Margaret's sophistication and elegance. Meanwhile, Patricia was clearly flustered. She kept glancing at Margaret with confusion, as if trying to solve a puzzle she couldn't understand. The reception began with Margaret dutifully taking her seat at the back table with the other relatives Patricia had deemed appropriate for her social level. But something unexpected happened during the dinner service. The maitre d' approached Patricia's table looking confused. "Mrs. Peterson, There seems to be some confusion about tonight's arrangements. Patricia looked up from her conversation. What kind of confusion? Well, someone has made significant upgrades to the entire event. The flower arrangements have been changed to premium orchids and roses. The menu has been upgraded to include lobster and premium wine selections. And there's been a surprise addition to the entertainment. Patricia's face went pale. Upgrades? Who authorized upgrades? The person who made the arrangements wishes to remain anonymous. They said the upgrades were a gift to honor the celebration of true family values. Margaret watched from her back table as Patricia frantically whispered to William. Both of them looked around the room as if trying to identify the mysterious benefactor. The upgraded dinner was extraordinary. Even Margaret, who could afford to eat at the finest restaurants, was impressed by the quality. The mysterious improvements had transformed an already expensive wedding into something truly spectacular. During dinner, Jake found his way to Margaret's table. "You look amazing tonight," he said quietly. "I almost didn't recognize you." "Thank you. How are you enjoying the evening?" Jake glanced toward his parents' table. "It's interesting. My parents have been asking everyone if they know who paid for the upgrades. They're desperate to thank whoever did it, but also worried about being upstaged at their own daughter's wedding." Margaret smiled. Sometimes anonymous kindness is the best kind. After dinner came the speeches. Patricia stood up first, welcoming everyone and talking about Rebecca's wonderful qualities and bright future. William spoke about David's potential and how proud they were to welcome him into their family. Then it was Margaret's turn. She had prepared 2 speeches. The short, humble one that Patricia had demanded, full of simple thank yous and brief comments. And the real one, which told a very different story. Margaret stood up and walked to the microphone. The room fell quiet as people turned to look at the elegant woman who had surprised everyone with her appearance. "Good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Margaret, David's mother." She paused and looked around the room, making eye contact with Patricia, who was watching nervously. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight to celebrate David and Rebecca. It means so much to see so many people who care about them." This was the safe opening. Patricia relaxed slightly. "You know, over the past few months, I've learned a great deal about the importance of family values, about how we treat the people we care about, and how we welcome new members into our families." Margaret could see David watching her intently. He knew his mother well enough to sense that something significant was about to happen. "I've also learned about the difference between wealth and worth, between having money and having character, between appearing successful and actually being generous." The room was completely silent now. Patricia looked like she was about to be sick. Which brings me to something I'd like to share with all of you tonight. Earlier this year, I had the privilege of establishing a foundation to support young artists who come from families that don't understand their talents. Jake's eyes widened as he began to understand what Margaret was saying. The foundation recently awarded its first fellowship to a remarkable young man whose artistic vision deserves support and encouragement. I'm proud to announce that Jake Peterson will be leading our new arts program with a full fellowship to pursue his creative dreams. The room erupted in confused whispers. Jake stared at Margaret in shock. Finally understanding who his anonymous benefactor had been, Patricia's face had gone completely white. "Margaret, what are you saying?" Margaret smiled graciously. Saying that I believe in supporting people with talent and character, regardless of whether their families appreciate them." She paused and let her eyes sweep across the room one more time. "I'm also saying that I recently made another donation. $2 million to establish a scholarship fund at the State University for first-generation college students. Students like my son David, who worked hard and deserved opportunities even when they didn't come from wealthy families." The room was dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. William stood up slowly. "Margaret, I think there's been some confusion." "Oh, there's no confusion," Margaret said with a smile. "I just wanted everyone to know that sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones who have the most to offer." She set down the microphone and walked back to her table, leaving a room full of very stunned wedding guests behind her. The real celebration was just beginning. The silence in the room stretched on for what felt like forever. Margaret could see the confusion and shock on every face as people tried to process what they had just heard. The humble, poor woman they had dismissed all evening had just announced donations worth millions of dollars. Patricia was the first to break. She stood up so quickly that her chair nearly fell over and rushed toward Margaret's table. Her face was a mixture of panic and desperate calculation. "Margaret, dear, I think there's been some terrible misunderstanding," Patricia said, her voice shaking slightly. "When you say you established a foundation—" "I mean exactly what I said," Margaret replied calmly. "I've been fortunate enough to be able to support causes that matter to me. Education and the arts are particularly close to my heart." William appeared beside his wife, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "Margaret, forgive me, but are you saying that you personally funded these donations?" Margaret looked up at both of them with a serene smile. "Is that so hard to believe?" Rebecca had joined her parents, her face pale with shock. But you work as a bookkeeper. You drive an old car. You live in that little house." "I did work as a bookkeeper," Margaret corrected gently, "for my own investment firm. As for the car and house, I find them perfectly adequate for my needs. I've never seen the point in showing off." Jake was still staring at Margaret in amazement. "You're the anonymous donor who paid for my art fellowship?" "Talent should be nurtured," Margaret said simply, "especially when families don't recognize its value." The implications of that statement hit Patricia like a slap. Her son's anonymous benefactor wasn't some stranger who had randomly chosen to help. It was the woman she had been insulting and dismissing for months. David finally found his voice. "Mom, are you telling us that you single quotes Dolphy?" Margaret looked at her son with love and sadness. "I'm telling you that I'm the same person I've always been. The same woman who raised you, who taught you to be kind and respectful to everyone, regardless of their situation. Money doesn't change who a person is, David, but it certainly reveals who other people really are." The pointed comment made several people in the room shift uncomfortably. "Why didn't you tell us?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret stood up slowly, maintaining her dignity. "Because I wanted to know what kind of people you really were. I wanted to see how you would treat someone you thought had no money or social status." She looked directly at Patricia. "I wanted to know if you would welcome your son's mother with kindness and respect, or if you would judge her based on her appearance and assumptions about her bank account." Patricia's face was burning red with embarrassment. Around the room, people were whispering and staring. The wealthy guests who had dismissed Margaret earlier were now looking at her with new respect and fear. They were realizing that they had just witnessed one of their own being publicly exposed for their cruel behavior. "Margaret, if we had known... William started. "Known what?" Margaret interrupted. "Known that I had money? Would that have made me a better person? Would that have made me more worthy of basic human decency?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. "You treated me badly because you thought I was poor," Margaret continued. "You excluded me from wedding planning because you assumed I couldn't afford to contribute. You seated me in the back because you were embarrassed by my appearance. You asked me to leave early because you didn't think I belonged with your important friends." With each statement, Patricia seemed to shrink smaller. "But the worst part," Margaret said, her voice getting stronger, "was watching my son apologize for me. Watching him make excuses for your behavior because he was so desperate to keep the peace." David's face crumpled. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have stood up for you." "Yes, you should have," Margaret said firmly but lovingly. "Not because I have money, but because I'm your mother and I deserve to be treated with respect." She turned back to Patricia and William. "Money doesn't make someone worthy of kindness. Being human does." The wedding reception had essentially stopped. The band was still playing softly in the background, but no one was dancing or talking. Everyone was watching the drama unfold at the back table that was supposed to hide the embarrassing relatives. Jake stood up and walked over to Margaret. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Not just for the fellowship, but for believing in me when my own family didn't." Your art has value, Margaret told him. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Patricia finally found her voice again. Margaret, please, I think we got off on the wrong foot. Perhaps we could start over. I had no idea about your situation. Margaret almost laughed. My situation? You mean the fact that I have money? Patricia, that's exactly the problem. You're only interested in being kind to me now because you know I'm wealthy. Where was this kindness 6 months ago? We were just trying to make sure everyone felt comfortable, Rebecca said weakly. Comfortable? Margaret's voice carried a sharp edge now. You told me my friends weren't good enough to sit with your friends. You cut my speech to 3 sentences because you thought I was too stupid to hold people's attention. You asked me to leave my own son's wedding early because you were embarrassed by me. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean it like that. You meant it exactly like that, Margaret said. And now you're crying because you realize you misjudged someone who could have been a valuable social connection. The brutal honesty of the statement made Rebecca flinch. Margaret picked up her purse and prepared to leave. She had said what needed to be said. The test was over, and everyone had failed spectacularly. Where are you going? David asked desperately. Home, Margaret said. You suggested I leave early, and for once I think that's excellent advice. Mom, please don't go. We need to talk about this. Margaret looked at her son with a mixture of love and disappointment. David, you have a choice to make. You can marry into a family that judges people based on their bank accounts, or you can marry into a family that values character and kindness, but you can't have both. She started walking toward the exit, her head held high. Behind her, she could hear Patricia frantically trying to salvage the situation. Margaret, wait, we can fix this. We can make this right. Margaret turned around one last time. Patricia, you can't fix character. You either have it or you don't. As Margaret reached the door, she heard David's voice calling after her. Mom, I'm coming with you. She turned to see her son leaving his own wedding reception, choosing his mother over his bride's family for the first time in months. David, no, Margaret said gently. This is your wedding day. Stay with your wife. Not if it means losing you, David said firmly. Margaret felt her heart break and heal at the same time. Finally, her son was standing up for what was right. You're not losing me, she told him. But Rebecca needs to decide if she wants to be part of a family that values people for who they are, not what they have. Margaret left the country club that night knowing that everything had changed. She had revealed the truth about who she was, but more importantly, she had revealed the truth about who everyone else was too. Some relationships would be repaired, others would end. But at least now, everyone knew exactly where they stood. Money hadn't bought Margaret respect that night. Her courage and dignity had earned it, and that was worth far more than $95 million.